Shabbat Shalom, everyone. The question that I have for us this morning, both on a very specific to this Parsha level, but also on a meta level, is, are we capable of changing? To what extent are any of us or each of us capable of changing? Why ask that question? Partly because so much of the pain or the frustration that we all experience in life is rooted in an inability or a seeming inability at times to change. Change is hard. Growth is hard. And in fact, so much of what we're called to do almost every day of our lives is change in some way. And I am going to argue this morning that Jacob, our patriarch, is in a sense the paradigmatic figure of someone who wrestles with his own need to grow and change. And so as we think about Jacob, we are also thinking about ourselves. We're also thinking about our own journeys through the struggles that come our way, through the challenges that we meet, both in ourselves, often in our families and our most intimate relationships, and yes, also in the broader world. All of those are things that invite or ask or even require us to change, and all of them represent our struggles. Jacob is about to have an encounter that will change him forever. A wrestling match with an ish that might be a messenger, it might be an angel, it might be some emanation of his brother, Esav, and it might also be himself. We don't actually know for sure who the ish is. So when I speak about this ish this morning, I'm going to use the word ish, which just means man or person. But Jacob, leading into his encounter with this angel, is potentially many, many things. When we were in Torah study this morning, someone pointed out, Jacob seems like he's all of the things that he has been at once, at any given moment. Right before, at the very beginning of our Parsha, we're told that he splits his camp into two, and that he encamps at a place called Machanayim, which is just Machaneh, camp, in the plural, two camps. But that's also a metaphor. A literary read of this text is pretty clear that Jacob himself feels divided in two. Who are the two halves of Jacob? What is Jacob wrestling? In last week, or actually 2 weeks ago's Parsha Toldot, when we heard about the birth of Jacob, we learned something that should be pretty key to understanding his psyche, and also to some of the struggles that any of us might experience in our own lifetime. And that is that we are told that upon the birth of Esav and Jacob, who are twins, V'ye'ehav Yitzchak et Esav, ki tzayid befiv, that Yitzchak loved Esav because he put in his mouth trapped foods. He made good barbecue. V'Rivka ohevet et Yaakov, and Rivka loved Yaakov. There are two things here. One is that we have a parent's love divided in two, that Yaakov is favored by his mother, but not just favored, loved. And Esav is loved by his father. Esav is loved with reason. He provides something. He has maybe even purpose that his father recognizes. And Jacob has unconditional love from his mother. Both of those are elements which make us healthy and whole in our lives. When we experience both love that is rooted in our worth and also unconditional love, it feels good and whole. And we have here evidence that Esav gets only one half of that equation and Jacob gets only one half of that equation. And so as Jacob grows, we can assume that he spends a lot of his life searching for that love that is rooted in worth, that love that is rooted in someone acknowledging not just that you are essentially good, but also that you have purpose and that you do good in the world. And a lot of Jacob's actions leading up to the moment which we're about to read, where he wrestles at the river, a lot of Jacob's actions are tricky. His whole name, Yaakov, that he's the heel and that he's grasping, is part of his character. That he often tricks his way into getting the things that he either deserves or wants, and never is able to arrive full and whole to seek that which he wants. He gets what he wants by means of trickery and not through being vulnerable or authentic or having integrity. And that is the Jacob that arrives at the river in our parsha. He knows that his brother Esav, who he's had this 20+ year long distance from, this feud over their birthright and over Jacob's act of trickery and betrayal, he knows that he's about to meet him and he's terrified. And in the night, he meets an Ish who wrestles with him until the dawn. And what we know of that encounter is that Jacob leaves it forever changed. So he leaves it forever changed in more than one way. The common way that we know is that Jacob's name is changed in that moment, that he wrestles and wrestles and wrestles, and he becomes named Yisrael. He also sustains an injury. Do you know what injury he sustains? A hip injury. An injury in his sciatic nerve, to be exact. And I want to talk about both of these things, both the sciatic nerve injury and the name change. And in order to talk about those, we just have to deal with one thing, which is this gigantic question of whether Yaakov is wrestling a real being or himself. And the fact is we don't know from the text. There's all ambiguities here, but there's one key phrase that I'm going to focus on in order to make sense of this for now. And that is that we are told that Yaakov traverses all of his people and his belongings across the Jabbok Creek, the Yabok, the river, and Vayivater Yaakov livado, and Yaakov is left alone. And then an Ish comes along. So one possibility is that he was alone and an Ish comes and he's no longer alone. And another possibility is that in his being alone, he has the space to confront this part of himself that he's in conflict with. That's a very psychoanalytic read, but if you'll allow me that, I'm personally convinced by it, and I think that it gets us to a pretty powerful place of understanding what's happening for Yaakov in this moment. When Yaakov wrestles with himself, he ultimately doesn't necessarily succeed, but he doesn't give up. He walks away injured in this fight, but he has continued to stay in the fight. And that is the part of Yaakov that gives us evidence that he has made a real growth in this moment, a real change. He's confronted that which is hard in his life instead of going around it. And in a sense, he emerges victorious in the sense that he has not allowed fright to overcome him. He's actually gone in the direction of that which is hard. So the injury that he sustains is in his hip. And if any of you have ever, well, there's two thoughts that I have. One is, have you ever experienced hip pain? Maybe raise your hand if you're in that crowd. A few people. Okay, it's not endemic in this room like I thought it might. It's really common that a place we hold tension is in our hips. Part of that is just like that Evolutionarily, the fact that we're upright beings is somewhat unique in the animal kingdom, and our hips are a huge hinge in the body. And the sciatic nerve is the largest nerve in the body, and it travels from the lower back down in your leg, and it's through the hip. And our hips, as that hinge in our body, hold an enormous amount of tension. And on top of that, I mean, I was laughing thinking this, but if you if you go to a yoga class, you do something called the hip opener. And a hip opener is something that forces you to kind of feel into that hip and into the tension that our hips often hold. And with feeling into the tension in the hip, you also are able to release tension. Why is this important? Because there's a line right after Yaakov is given his new name by this Ish. He says back to the Ish, Higida na shemecha. And I want you to hear how the Hebrew sounds, even if you don't understand the Hebrew. Higida na shemecha. The word, I'll tell you what that means in a second. The word for the sciatic nerve is gid hanasheh. Higida na shemecha, gid hanasheh. There's a real closeness, and these verses are within 3 lines of one another that we're told, Higida na shemecha, please pray, tell me your name, is what Yaakov says to the angel. And the angel does not answer him. This Ish never gives a name. He says, oh, I can't tell you that, disappears. And then we're told Jacob limps off, forever injured in his hip. His gid hanasheh will not be eaten by the people Yisrael forevermore. The gid hanasheh is the reason why Jewish people do not eat the hindquarters of animals that are slaughtered. It is true that there's ways to actually get around the gid hanasheh, and you can eat some of the hindquarters, but it's a very technical way of doing it, and most Ashkenazim don't even try, and the Ashkenazim sell the back half of the animal, whereas Mizrahim actually still know how to do nikur, remove the gid hanasheh, and can consume the back half of the animal. But we keep in our tradition this memory of this moment by not ever consuming the part of the body that contains this sciatic nerve. The thing that I found so remarkable, and this is a teaching from Shmuel Klitzner, who wrote a book called Wrestling Jacob, Deception, Identity, and Freudian Slips. So yes, he is doing a psychoanalytic read of this text. He says what is so amazing is gid hanasheh. Gid is a sinew, and nasheh means forgetting. So yes, gid hanasheh is just the name of the sciatic nerve, but encoded in the Hebrew is actually this, that it is the sinew of forgetting. So I want to make an argument this morning that what is happening when Yaakov experiences this encounter is this part of our body that feels so much. This vulnerable part of us is the place where we put our forgetting, where we put all the pain, all the tension, all the things we would rather forget, and it goes into the way that we hold that pain and try to walk through the world bravely, courageously, but also sometimes trying to forget the things that hurt. And what happens in this encounter is that is the part of Yaakov that is injured, attacked, and maybe even opened up. That he no longer is going to try to forget who he is, but rather confront who he is, and he walks forward more whole. In chapter 33, still a part of our parsha, we get this image of Yaakov. He says, Vayavo Yaakov Shalem, Ir Shechem. And Yaakov went Shalem, whole, or safely, to Ir Shechem, to a place. The image that we're left with is a Yaakov that is finally unified. In a sense, this injury that he physically embodies is also an emotional healing for him. He who has carried so much, so many generations of trauma, finally moves through and toward the trauma into a place of wholeness and healing. And I hope that because he is our patriarch and he is a teacher to us in what he does, we also can feel into the injury that heals, the pain that gives way to healing, and that we can learn from him a little bit about how to live and how to grow. Shabbat Shalom.